you ever watched this movie? A nail-biting survival thriller inspired by a true incident where a group of soccer players and coach got stuck in an infamous cave in Thailand in 2018. But the heavy rainfall flooded the whole cave system, trapping them inside for 18 days. If you want something more terrible and shocking, there's another real incident from 2003, where an American mountain climber got stuck under a big rock that fell, and he had to cut his own arm off to come out. You might have already heard of it because of this film. But none of these come close to the horror of what happened in the Andes Flight Disaster in 1972. Because here we're talking about 45 people who were trapped 11,710 feet high above sea level for 2.5 months, where temperature stays around -40 degrees Celsius. Science says if it's -40 degrees Celsius outside, most people would not survive for more than 10 minutes in such extreme cold, causing hypothermia. Still, 1/3 of them incredibly survived, which the whole world called a miracle. But how did they survive the extreme weather? How did they get water and food? Well, that's the most unimaginable and shocking part ever in human history. It all started on October 12, 1972, with a chartered plane leaving Uruguay's Carrasco International Airport for Santiago, the capital of Chile, with 45 people on board, including a rugby team. The flight was about 3 hours long, and during this journey, they had to cross the massive Andes Mountains, the longest mountain range in the world. But they had to take an unscheduled stop in Mendoza, Argentina, due to a storm over the Andes. Going directly to Santiago could be dangerous because of the high mountains and the plane's operational ceiling. Normally, the plane took a longer U-shaped route, covering 600 kilometers in 90 minutes from Mendoza to Malargüe, then west to Santiago. On October 13th, the weather was still rough, but it was expected to improve in the early afternoon. So, at 2:18 p.m., the pilot took off from Mendoza, heading south to Malargüe. The radio indicated their position and the plan to reach Planchón Pass at 3:21 p.m. After entering Chile, south of Curico, the plan was to turn north and start landing into Santiago International Airport. In the middle of the flight, the pilot mentioned a little turbulence once. However, none of the passengers felt worried. But things changed when the plane experienced a second air pocket, causing it a sudden severe drop. The passengers suddenly could see a mountain face just 10 or 20 feet away from them. "Is it normal to fly so close?" one of the passengers, Panchito Abal, asked his friend Nando Parado. "I don't think so," Parado replied, and within a moment, their world went black. In just a blink of an eye, the plane crashed into a mountain because the co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguara, made a terrible mistake. He thought they were close to where they were supposed to land, but they were still about 60 to 70 kilometers away. Trying to go higher, the plane hit the mountain multiple times, and at 4,200 meters, the tail broke off, taking a navigator, a steward, rows of seats, and 3 passengers with it. This was just the beginning of the end. The plane's left wing broke at 4,400 meters, causing a rapid fall. The cockpit and the front crashed into a snowbank at 350 kilometers per hour, killing 4, including pilot Ferradas. Co-pilot Lagarara died the next morning too. Among the survivors were medical students, 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, injured but alive, and they tried to help others as much as they could. 2 passengers had severe open fractures. One of them, Arturo Nogueira, died from multiple leg fractures. Another passenger, Enrique Platero, had a piece of metal stuck in his belly, and when Canessa and Zerbino took it out, it also pulled out a few inches of his intestine, killing him in some hours. Out of the rest of the 33 survivors, some had broken legs from seats falling out or other serious injuries. Nando Parado was in a coma for 3 painful days because of a crack in his skull due to the crash. On the other hand, when the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service received a message about a missing flight, 4 planes started a search operation until nightfall on the first day, but the exact crash site was unknown. On the second day, 11 planes continued the search. Meanwhile, on the first night, 5 more had died, leaving only 28 survivors who did every possible thing to get discovered. They tried to create an SOS message on the airplane's roof with lipstick, but not enough lipsticks were there. They even made a cross with luggages in the snow, screamed to the rescue planes, but nothing worked. Still, The survivors thought it's just a few bad days. The rescue team was about to come any moment. Little did they know of what horror was waiting for them. The weather was rough, and the rescuers thought there was no chance to find anyone alive and stopped looking on October 21st. They planned to start again in December when the weather was better, but it was too late. So, until that time, the survivors were on their own with fatal injuries, sub-zero temperature, zero medical supplies, no warm clothes, water, and food. So, at first, they had to take care of the two major concerns, the extreme cold and water crisis. To get rid of the extreme weather, they did something incredible under the leadership of Marcelo Perez, one of the survivors. They made a simple shelter using broken seats and other stuff from the wreckage. The space was small, about 2.5 by 3 meters. They used luggage, seats, and snow to close one end, which created a somewhat better condition. To solve the other critical problem of the water crisis, a survivor, Vito Strauch, figured out a way. He made a solar collector from sheet metal and snow, and melted snow into wine bottles. Not only that, there were some other problems too. For example, they had to protect their eyes from the bright snow. When the bright sun gets reflected upon the snow, it becomes too shiny to see with naked eyes. It's called ultraviolet keratitis, and it can literally blind anyone. So, Fito made sunglasses too using sun visors, wire, and a bra strap. They also used seat covers and cushions to stay warm and make snowshoes. Meanwhile, one of the rugby players, Roy Harley, found a small radio. He made a long antenna with electrical cable, but it had a problem. The survivors could only hear things but could not send any messages, and much to their disappointment, on the 11th day, they turned on the radio just to hear that the search operation was postponed. They understood that they're all done and had to find their own way out. Meanwhile, just by the end of the 11th day, they faced the third major problem, the food crisis. Whatever the food they had, 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of almonds, some dates, candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine was almost over. After the crash, they tried to make this small amount of food last as long as possible by dividing it into tiny portions. For example, Parado himself ate just 1 chocolate-covered peanut over 3 days. Even with such careful sharing, their food supply quickly ran out. The area where the crash happened didn't have any plants or animals, and it was too high up for hunting or finding food. They starved for nearly a week and became so desperate for food that they tried eating parts of the airplane, like the cotton inside the seats and leather. But this made them even sicker. While starving to death and becoming extremely weak, the survivors ended up making the most horrific, morally questionable, and the toughest decision in human history ever. They decided to eat the flesh and blood from the dead bodies of those who died in the crash. They also agreed that if any of them died, the others could eat their bodies to stay alive. In simple forms, cannibalism. Even though some people were against it because of moral and religious reasons, the survivors had no choice but to do something drastic. Roberto Canessa decided to be the first to cut into one of the dead bodies. It was really stressful for them because they were not just eating any meat, it was their friends or loved ones. They used a piece of glass to cut into the body and had to eat the meat after drying them in the sun. At first, they were so disgusted that they could only eat the skin, muscle, and fat. But when those ran out, they started eating hearts, lungs, and brains too. Only Parado protected the corpses of his mother and sister, Susana, and they were never eaten. The corpse of another passenger, Javier Metol's nephew, was also spared. What the survivors did next was not exactly cannibalism, which is usually seen as a sneaky way of eating someone. It's more accurately called anthropophagy. Amidst all the odds, mental trauma, and physical injuries, when they somewhat tried to settle in, another terrifying thing came into the scene that again threatened their lives. After the 17 days of the plane crash, on October 29th, a big snowslide hit the survivors' plane, killing 8 more survivors, including the team captain Marcelo Perez. They were stuck in a tiny space covered in snow. And on October 31st, they tried to rescue themselves, but a snowstorm stopped them. They thought about walking to get help, but it was too hard to walk even a few steps due to altitude sickness, dehydration, snow blindness, malnourishment, and extreme cold. But they had to seek help, otherwise they wouldn't last long. So finally, Canessa, Parado, and Visitin had to go out for help after losing hope of finding a radio. They made a makeshift sleeping bag using plain insulation, copper wire, and waterproof fabric with the help of Carlitos, who was good at sewing. On December 12th, without any proper mountain gear or experience, they started a tough journey through the mountains, carrying only a 3-day supply of meat. They climbed a glacier covering 61 kilometers in 10 days, thinking they were close to Curico. By the 3rd day of the journey, Canessa stayed at camp while Visitin and Parado encountered a nearly vertical wall of snow. Parado still carved steps and managed to reach the peak, and to their surprise, they realized they were on the border between Argentina and Chile, not in the green valleys of Chile as they had expected. Running out of food, Visitin used an airplane seat as a sled. Meanwhile, Parado and Canessa faced snowy mountains and chose a tough path down. Parado believed in finding a way out, and they ended up in a valley after days of walking where they found a water stream, Rio San Jose. Following a river, they found signs of people and saw 3 men on horses. Communication was hard due to the loud river noise, but the next day they managed to convey their plane crash and urgent situation by throwing a note across the river. Sergio Catalan, a Chilean cattle herder, found their distress note and rode for 10 hours to get help. He told authorities at Puente Negro and got another herder to assist survivors, Parado and Canessa. They walked 61 kilometers in 10 days to reach Los Maitenes, where Canessa, who lost nearly half of his weight, could rest. Parado also led Chilean Air Force helicopters to rescue the rest of the survivors on December 22, 1972. But due to weight limits, they had to make multiple trips. The survivors endured a nightmarish and inhumane 72-day wait. The next morning, a second helicopter flight transported the remaining survivors to hospitals in Santiago for treatment. The rescue mission continued until December 23, 1972, when the last of the 16 survivors were finally rescued. Unfortunately, the search team had to leave the frozen, half-eaten deceased at the crash site in Argentina. But they got to know what a miraculous and extraordinary survival saga it was, something beyond anyone's imagination.